And I want to thank SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Authority, which is partially funding this program. They want to make sure that you understand that any of the views expressed does not necessarily represent SAMHSA's views. That's a very small group. And it may not represent Next Steps views, but they're important. That they're dedicated as Next Steps is to continuing the conversation. And then the third thing, the fourth thing I wanted to say was about the concept of a conversation and the way that I personally would like you to deal with this conversation. Now, as we all know, there are many ways to listen. And the most common way to listen is you just sort of download what people say. You know, the professor talks, you write it down, and then eventually on an exam you write it out. The other way is what lawyers normally do. You listen to what people say just so you can then eventually disagree with them. But the third way, and the most important way, is to listen so that you and the person who is talking becomes changed. That involves it's much harder, and that's what I'm asking you to do. Now, I can't do it all the time, and I'm not sure that you're going to be able to do that, but what we're having here is a conversation, a dialogue. And as we mentioned, part of this dialogue is in this room with over 100 people, but we're also going to continue this dialogue in smaller, more intimate sessions. And we're convinced that by having this kind of dialogue, we can make fundamental change. Now, I always tell people that 3 people sitting around in a coffee shop are going to fundamentally change the world. There's no question in my mind. The only question is whether we're going to be those 3 people. So the same way as 100 people sitting in a room like this are going to fundamentally change the world. The only question is whether you and us are part of those 100 people. So with that, I turn it over to Monica. I turn it over to
Dan.
Yeah.
Hello. How is everyone?
Good.
Good deal. I have to make a joke, and I'm going to age myself because I see some younger people here. Has anyone seen Pinky and the Brain? We're going to rule. I just had a Pinky and the Brain.
You're not the first person to have that flashback tonight.
So thank you for that. You made my day. So my name is Deanne Benos, and I'm here because of Monica. I want to thank for the invite. And I'm representing an organization or a project I founded called the Women's Justice Initiative. Is this working? Am I talking? I've lost my voice a little bit. Is this good?
Louder, please.
Yes, louder. Yeah, it was. Oh, I didn't feel the
Right in the
echo.
mic.
There we go. Oh,
There.
right in. Oh, here we go. Okay. So one more time. I'm Deanne Benos, and I'm here representing a project I founded called the Women's Justice Initiative. And the Women's Justice Initiative is a project at Health and Disability Advocates, is where we're housed, which works to address structural and social barriers to economic and health empowerment. I found it, today, I looked through a bunch of things I was going to talk about today, and I really love the idea of a conversation and people changing one another. And in my remarks today, I'm going to talk about the story of how we founded this project and how it deeply relates to what we're talking about here today, which is mental health in prisons. Before I begin, I had to start by being a little bit sassy. And saying that as I did a very cliched thing, and I looked at the title, and it says, Mental Health in Prisons, What is the Problem and How Do We Solve It? And I couldn't help but be a little sassy, and the first thing that came to my mind, and the first thing that I thought of was, stop criminalizing mental illness, right? That's like the first thing that I would say. And then the second idea I had was even a little bit nastier. And when I come up with my responses, having worked with the system, I guess I can say it. And that was, you know what? I would like to either diagnose the system the way the system diagnoses the people that are in it.
Oh, nice idea.
And I think that we would, or come up with another angle for how we're actually treating these issues. And so with that, I wanted to touch on the Women's Justice Initiative. it's interlinked to my story in working in corrections. I, at a very young age, became the assistant director of the Illinois Department of Corrections, and someone that was a complete outsider to the way that the system operates. So you can imagine my surprise, especially as someone who experienced significant childhood trauma that's affected me in my life, to walk through prisons and to see how men and women were treated in the lens of that system. And what struck me most about it were so many things that are related to the worst of our society. What I found, and this is also a cliche, but all of society's failures are what we dump sometimes, and you find, sadly, at the other end of the system. When you walk through a system, what I see is the failure of not of individuals, but of society at every step of the way. And for me, and for my personal story and sharing what I'm going to share today, it was more pronounced. I mean, people are victimized, or they suffer many different experiences throughout the department, whether they're a man or a woman. But what I'm sharing today is the perspective as a woman who, by the time I left that system, I felt, I guess it's hard to articulate this, but having walked through women's prisons and also been a woman working in the system that wasn't totally bought into the processes and procedures and the mindless operations there, I felt more akin to the women that were incarcerated there than the people that I worked with many times, in how I related to what was happening and what I saw. And what I saw was a system of, and I want to stop myself and say, it's a system where you're going to find some of the best people in the world, the best people, and you will find the absolute worst. And then you're going to find people in the middle who don't feel powered or don't care enough to be empowered to make a difference. And so, you know, I would say that when I walked through and I talked about founding the Women's Justice Initiative, it was that I saw that, you know, we have a system where it's well documented, it's not new information, that 98% of the women that are incarcerated have experienced domestic violence and sexual assault. Rates of abuse, reported abuse, that are at least 5 times higher than those of incarcerated men. You find a system where more than 75%, I think it is, or 73% of incarcerated women versus 55% of men are in a mental health caseload. And when you look back at those figures, you find that, you know, men and women both experience unique pathways, and neither are good. The pathway to prison is never a good thing. However, the pathways of women are unique to men in such a way that they are further, women end up, I guess, damaged in a different way than men when they go to prison, because they're going into a system that was designed by men, is run predominantly by men. You walk through Logan Correctional Center, 70% white male officers, a disproportionate number, it's 100% women, right, for the most part, but a disproportionate population of women of color. So you have a system that's designed by men, originally for a population of predominantly men, and we've squished women into it at an increasingly and alarming rate across the country. So having worked at the system and kind of moving forward, what I'm saying, I saw these societal failures repeatedly with the women that were incarcerated throughout the system, and antiquated policies and practices and procedures for addressing their needs, especially in the area of mental health, where, you know, women's PTSD symptoms and trauma symptoms are, again, criminalized again, and they become re-victimized by a system that in itself, through confinement, triggers coping mechanisms for trauma. And so what you see is, you see a system where you're taking individuals that have largely experienced complex trauma and victimization because of society's failure throughout their lives, And then they're thrown in misogyny and social and cultural barriers that exist in the actual society. And then you say, guess what, we're not done. We're gonna make it 10 times worse and throw you in prison, where we're gonna make it worse. And so it deeply moved me. And in fact, I had left my job maybe 7 years ago, and part of my going away conversation with my boss at the time was that I'm so glad you're leaving, because I'm going to eliminate that women's division you work so hard on, because a man can run it just as well, and it's a waste of money to treat women differently. And so frankly, I had, which I don't say that some men can't do that, but founded the Women's Justice Initiative because what we're trying to do is basically bring national standards and best practices that are based on evidence-based, and so long sentence, gender-responsive practices that are designed to work with women into the Illinois prison system.
Catchy.
It's catchy, right? I can admit that sometimes backwards. And what we did last year was we brought a team, it was about a year and a half ago, we brought a team of assessors into the women's prison system, about 18 to be exact, to run what's called the Gender-Informed Practices Assessment of the Illinois Department of Corrections Logan Correctional Center. And what we did was we walked through with those assessors, and they were a wide range of women from different organizations and experiences with the prison system, including Colette, who's one of our assessors here. And we examined the system on all 3 shifts, all domains, service areas for the level of gender responsivity of the system. And we recently released a report of our findings, recommendations in November of last year. The experience, we're happy to say, we're not happy with the findings that we released, but we're happy to say that the department has committed to working with us and a group of stakeholders that we're building a network right now to address the challenges of the system and to restore and build an even better gender-responsive framework for working with women throughout the system. So right now we're in that stage where we're collecting information and gathering that. Quickly, I'll share some of the findings that we released. One is that purely a lack of training. Male officers in the prison system are trained 1.5 hours, if that, on working with women in a 6-week training academy. And until last year, and likely due to the results of Alan's work, perhaps with others, they'd never been trained on trauma to work with men or women. So 1 hour, basically, on how you work with a female that's a woman that may have experienced victimization and trauma to prepare them. The result has been women are received 3 to 5 times more disciplinary violations and tickets for behaviors, largely insolence, because men and women tend to, generalizing, but communicate differently. Women, since Logan Correctional Center used to be a male prison and the officers weren't trained to work with women for the period of time, women were sentenced, or basically given 127,000 segregation days for behaviors, including insolence. That's not even possible for someone to serve that amount of time. Women have had 88,000 days added to their sentences for behavioral infractions. And all of these infractions most disproportionately affect women with mental health issues. By and large, that's what we found. And then just finishing up there, we also found waiting lists for programs to increase. We found that assessments that the department has used for decades were not validated ever to determine the unique risks and needs of women. And then when the department bought a new assessment tool, the tool actually had allowed for the purchase of one that was designed and validated for women, and they instead chose to test that tool on the male tool on women until our project. So basically, when you walk through, you see a system that a prison, the largest prison, one of the largest in the country for women in the most complex populations, is Logan Correctional Center. It was a male prison for a long time, converted to a female facility with no training. Some close to 2,000 women at some points, almost 800 of which have been diagnosed with serious mental illness. 98% of which have suffered domestic and sexual abuse in their lifetime, 75% at minimum diagnosed with trauma. And they are managed by a 70% male staff that doesn't relate to those issues and has never been trained to do so. So when we talk about problems, that's a problem. And I know we're going to have a conversation more, and I'm doing exactly what I was not supposed to do and talk for a long time after. So I will say the only upside of that and the solutions that I hope we'll engage more in today is that we were able to use, what we were able to use was national standards and go to Washington and say, oh, Illinois is not doing it right, so we are leaning on national standards. So we were able to,
First time I heard that.
right, right. We were able to work with the director of the system who endorsed our recommendations in our report, committed to working with us to restore gender-responsive practices over the next 3 years in a partnership, engage a series of stakeholders, and as we talk later on, one of our deliverables has been creating new legislation being sponsored by Representative Juliana Stratton to mandate by law that gender-responsive practices are the law of the land and women are treated appropriately and distinctly based on their gender from men. And we also began the state's first ever 5-day gender-responsive training program. And so I spent, a couple weeks ago, I spent the week with some new cadets.
Wait, who's getting trained? Who are they training
Guards.
on?
The guards at the prison to work with women and understand
To
their
work with
pathways.
women.
And I will end with this note, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it. But when we went to the training, I asked the cadets who had come out of a 6-week training academy, which went very well, actually, despite this. I said, how many of you thought when you came into a prison that you could affect someone's life when you came in, that the way you engaged with women could affect their lives? And not one raised their hand. And I said, well, why did you think this was your job? Well, we spent 6 weeks learning to lock doors, that people were dangerous. And I said, how many of you were taught to humanize, to understand the people that you're dealing with, or to communicate with them in a trauma-informed way, considering 800 of the 2,000 people here have serious mental illness? Not one. So we're starting from ground zero in this work, and it's also a bellwether of what's happening in the men's prisons, but of course it's uniquely defined by the women's facilities. So thanks for the opportunity to share that, and I look forward to learning from everyone here.
My name is Alan Mills. I'm the Executive Director of the Uptown People's Law Center. We are a small little storefront clinic. There's 6 people who work there total. We're located in Uptown, as you might guess from our name. And we represent disabled people in the community who are trying to get Social Security. We represent tenants who are facing wrongful conviction. But the reason I'm here today is because we also represent prisoners throughout the state of Illinois when their constitutional rights are violated. We're now focusing mostly on class action cases, and we have 9 of them. Against the Illinois Department of Corrections or related entities, one of which relates to the mental health care that is or really isn't provided to prisoners throughout the state of Illinois. I think when we talk about the prison system, I want to steal a line from Stephen Bright, a hero of mine, another lawyer in the South. The civil rights movement has never reached the prison system. It's the one part of society that the civil rights movement has not really impacted. Deanne talked a little bit about the racial makeup, and that is true throughout the criminal justice system. If you walk through any prison in the state, you'll see that it's overwhelmingly black. Figures on drug use alone, for example, show that drugs are used at the same rates by any class or race in society, but when you talk about who gets locked up for drugs, it's almost exclusively young black men. It's all about who we choose to enforce which laws against, what sort of penalties we choose to enforce against which defendants, and how long we keep them in prison. So the racial part of civil rights has not reached the prison system, nor has the mental health part. There's been a lot of litigation around the rights of mentally ill people in society. That also has not reached the prison system. As Deanne said, about over half the people in the prison system suffer from some form of mental illness, and that is not recognized. The other really important thing to understand about the prison system is how big it is. The often quoted statistic is that the United States has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its prisoners, a bigger prison population than any other country in the world, both in terms of percentage and actual numbers. Its population has gone up by about 5 times since the late 1970s, and it hasn't worked. We are not safer now. There are not fewer drugs. The war on drugs has not had any impact whatsoever other than having millions and millions of people locked in cages. And in terms of mentally ill people, we are now locking up in institutions exactly the same number of people as we locked up in institutions in the 60s before the Civil Rights Movement closed all of the big state snake pit hospitals where we used to send off into oblivion mentally ill people. We got them out of there, and for a while we were deinstitutionalizing, but then at the same time the number of people in prison started to rise. And it's a big U. It went down and went back up, and we're now exactly where we started, except instead of being in hospitals, they're now in cages. But they're still locked into institutions. They're still being provided just as bad care, or maybe even worse care, than they were when this movement started. So the first thing is exactly what you said. People who are mentally ill, what's the problem? They don't belong in prison at all. So there's a movement to get them out, and that's great. But the tension in this movement is that there are also people who are suffering right now today. So it's always a tension. Do we make prisons better? Do I build a better cage to keep people in? Because there really isn't a humane cage to keep people in. Caging people is not humane. On the other hand, do we just leave the people that are in prison who are truly suffering today and say, too bad, you have to keep suffering until we solve the larger problem? The Uptown People's Law Center has brought cases about mental health, and because of the way our court system is structured, those cases can't say, let everybody out of prison. So because of the forum we've chosen to work in, we end up building a better prison system, or at least a bigger prison system, or one that hopefully will relieve some suffering. And the suffering is very real. So I brought some pictures. So part of my job today is to show everybody what prisons look like. For those of you who haven't been inside, and I'm going to talk about the 4 biggest prisons, 3 male, 1 female, where we keep most of our mentally ill people, which also are the maximum security prisons. Working from the southern part of Illinois is Menard Correctional Center. It's located on the Mississippi River, about an hour and a half to 2 hours south of St. Louis. Many people think of St. Louis as being far southern Illinois. It actually isn't. Illinois keeps going another 3 hours beyond St. Louis. So it's way down on the southern end. It looks like an old sandstone castle, and it is. It was started in the 1860s, and the new parts were finished in the 1920s. So it is an old prison. One of our experts said it is the dirtiest, loudest, most disgusting prison they've ever been in, and they've worked all over the country. This is a typical inside of the cell house, one of the old cell houses at Menard. This is the one that's called East-West House. Oddly enough, at Menard, there are 2 big cell houses. One is called East-West, one is North-South, but they are parallel to each other, so how they decided which is which, I have no idea. This is the inside of one of those cells. 2 people live in there. You can see that 2 people can probably stand up at the same time, but they can't both move at the same time. And people are in those cells 22 to 24 hours a day, not because they've done anything wrong, but because there's nothing for them to do. Budget cuts means that we have eliminated education programs, vocational programs. Most jobs are gone inside prisons. Most educational programs are gone. There are no college classes offered at a place like Menard Correctional Center. Most people simply sit there and stare at the walls 22 hours a day. They get out to go to meals, they get out a total of 5 hours to go to yard, and that's it. Otherwise, they're sitting in those cells. This one has an open front bars like you often see on TV, but an awful lot of the cells at Menard are closed front cells like this one. It's exactly the same inside, and there's a second bunk up above there you can't see, except there's not even the light that would come through bars. So you're in a dark, airless cell 22 to 24 hours a day. These are extraordinarily destructive places to be in, toxic to people's mental health, toxic to people's physical health, and in fact, there are a number of times when people are attacking their cellmates because they are in such stress, living in that close proximity without any relief, without any privacy. The chain that you see on this door here was because one cellmate killed the other cellmate in this very cell. That's why we have the pictures, the exhibits in the criminal case that was brought. Stateville Correctional Center is the one up by Chicago. It's in Joliet. It's about an hour south of Chicago, depending how bad traffic is. It is mostly empty now. It used to have the roundhouses, which you see in the middle of that picture. It was the last remaining panopticon in use in the country. It was a horrific place to be incarcerated. Luckily, it was closed in December, so nobody is there now. The two new parts of Stateville, which are the sort of star-shaped cells you can see at the top and the bottom of the picture there, were built in the 1980s and closed in the 2000s. They were falling apart. They were the new parts of Stateville. They were prefab, and apparently they started to settle, and the doors didn't shut anymore, and apparently locking doors is a big deal in prisons. They seem to think that's important. So they stopped using them. So the only one that's left is a huge big unit, and my pointer doesn't go that far, in the bottom right-hand corner of that building. It's called B House, and it is the longest cell house in the country, I am told. The cells inside look very much the same. This is two people packed into a cell which was originally meant for one person. Because our prison system started expanding so rapidly, they simply welded a second bunk above the first bunk. Again, people spend 22 to 24 hours a day sitting in those cells. This cell and this B house was finished also in the 1920s. In 1970, there was a study done which decided that Stateville was well past its useful life and should be closed. Instead, it's still open today, and we've doubled the number of people we put there. This is Dixon Correctional Center in Dixon, Illinois, out to the west. It is the place we put, I'm sorry, this is Pontiac. Sorry. This is Pontiac in the middle of the state, the third of our maximum security prisons. It too has two cell houses, east, west, north, south, but here actually the north, south ones point north, south, and east, west are east, west. It looks a lot like Menard, except this is where we put the most seriously mentally ill people in the state. These are crisis cells. So when someone is suicidal, they get locked behind one of these doors, and somebody comes by every 15 minutes or 10 minutes or 5 minutes to make sure you're not dead. But otherwise, they're just locked in the cell 24 hours a day until they say, no, I'm not going to kill myself. And then they're put back out into one of the other horrible little cells. It is
Kill themselves after that.
It is loud. It is people pounding on the doors, people screaming all day long. It is bedlam. In a very literal sense, it is bedlam. Nobody gets better in a crisis cell. Nobody. Dixon Correctional Center is where we allegedly have the most intense mental health provision in the state, treatment in the state. It's not a lot better than the rest of it. There's just a lot more concentration of mentally ill people there. We have two different parts of Dixon. Dixon is mostly a minimum security prison. All but the bottom left-hand corner there is the regular minimum security prison. The bottom left-hand corner is what they call the special treatment unit. And it has two parts. It has a series of cottages, which is very much like the ones they have at Logan. And those are called residential treatment units. It's supposed to be an outpatient level of care or a residential level of care for the most seriously mentally ill people. And then there's an X house, which is for maximum security, very mentally ill people, and they too spend about 24 hours a day locked in their cells. But allegedly they get more mental health treatment than they would at a place like Pontiac. Where am I? So that's where we are. That's what these places look like. And that's where people sit all day long. And that has really bad effects on people. So a couple of people, we filed this lawsuit about the fact that people are tortured rather than treated. And about a year ago, the state settled that lawsuit. And in the settlement, they're going to provide a hospital so that there is hospital level care. Those people who are the most serious mental in Illinois do not get to go to a hospital, unlike every other state in the country. We do not have one. Even though there's a system of state mental health hospitals, it is not available to people from prison, and therefore they don't go to hospitals if they're mentally ill and need to be in one. The residential level of care that started at Dixon is supposed to spread. They're supposed to be opening the new Joliet, opening the old Joliet Youth Prison, which has been closed for about a decade, as a dedicated mental health facility. It is completely reconstructed, but it is not yet open because we have no budget and therefore no one to staff it. So it is sitting there empty today, waiting for patients and waiting for people to treat. There's supposed to be an increase in the number of mental health professionals so that they can actually have caseloads where they can sit down and talk to somebody, because that does not happen right now. Almost nobody gets one-on-one therapy at all in the Department of Corrections. You may get medical checkups with your psychiatrist, which consist of 5-minute brief interviews to make sure you're not having ill side effects from the medication that's prescribed. In a lot of those prisons, those are happening over TV. It's not even a one-on-one, face-to-face interview. It also requires the department to redo the way they're using segregation for people who are seriously mentally ill. The default has been punishment, isolation, and medication. We're trying to get away from that. They're no longer supposed to be punishing people for conduct which is actually a symptom of their mental illness, rather than because they're evil people or want to break the rules, which has been happening all the time. We regularly get letters from people and have talked to people who, for example, try to hang themselves by tearing up a sheet, make it into a rope, and they get a disciplinary report for destruction of state property, tearing up the sheet, rather than getting medical care. The reason we had to do this is because we met hundreds of people who were suffering terribly. Tiffany was at Logan Correctional Center. She was suicidal. She first tried suicide at the age of 12. She continued to try to commit suicide during her time at Logan. They tried strapping her down to a bed in 5-point restraints so that she could not move. As soon as she got out, she'd try to kill herself again. They ended up putting her in a crisis cell, assigning a guard to watch her through a glass window 24 hours a day to stare at her. That was the guard's only job. She had no property whatsoever in the cell, just a suicide smock, and nothing else to do all day except stare at the wall. They kept her alive. That's all they did, was keep her alive. When her sentence was up, then the state moves to have her involuntarily committed to a hospital. So she went to a hospital and started getting better. But while she was in the Department of Corrections, all that happened was she got worse and worse and worse. I met Thomas the other day at Pontiac Correctional Center. He spent a year. In some ways, he's an ideal inmate. Doesn't cause anybody any problems. He suffered from deep depression along with a host of other problems. He spent an entire year in his cell, never coming out of the cell, often covered in his own feces, and nobody was paying attention to him at all. Nobody said, this is a problem. Instead, they just said, well, you're not causing any trouble, so we'll ignore you. Tyrone, also at Pontiac, he can't read or write. The only diagnosis I've seen is that he's low functioning. He has managed to get 100 years of segregation time to do still. He has 100 more years of segregation to do. He got a letter the other day saying they'd reviewed his segregation under our settlement agreement and had agreed to cut some of that 100 years. They cut it all the way down to 90. It's Kafkaesque. This idea that somebody should spend another 90 years in segregation, should be happy that it cut down from 100. If he lives to be 135, then he'll get out of segregation. Assume he doesn't get any other violations at all for the next 90 years. Those are extreme cases. Burrell, however, at Stateville is a much more, still an extreme case, but not quite as bad in some ways, but worse in others. So Burrell has a whole series of health problems. He's 60 years old. He's been in prison for many years. Prison is not a healthy place to be. If you have physical problems, they tend to get worse. He's a diabetic, hasn't been treated right. He's in a wheelchair now. His legs aren't working right. And they told him last fall that they were very likely have to amputate his legs. At the same time, his uncle died. And his mother went into a coma, and he and his brother were going to have to decide whether or not to pull the plug. He also suffers from depression and some other mental illnesses, but he's fairly functional despite his mental illnesses. But he desperately needed to talk to somebody. I would too if I was facing those problems, right? So he asked to see a crisis team member because that's how you start off getting help in prisons when he got this phone call saying, you're going to have to decide whether to unplug your mom. And he said, I need to talk to a crisis. They came and they did an assessment and said, you're not suicidal. And he's like, I know I'm not suicidal. I need to talk to somebody. And they're like, well, crisis is just for suicide. So they actually gave him a disciplinary report for falsely reporting he was having a crisis. When faced with people like this, we are not willing to say, we're just going to wait until we get everybody out of prison. We have to solve some of these problems today. So we are fighting to improve the conditions that mentally ill people face in prison, while we also work, other than in the court, to get people out of prison altogether, because they don't belong there. But if we're going to lock people up who are seriously mentally ill, we need to treat them. We cannot leave people like Thomas sitting in a cell, rolling around in his own feces, and nobody cares about it. I am not willing to live in a state that does that without fighting to change it, and that's what we do at the Uptown People's Law Center.
Good evening. Can you guys hear me?
No, barely.
No? Yeah?
Yeah, there you go. Big
Hey,
voice.
my name is Colette Payne, and I work for Cabrini Green Legal Aid. I'm the community organizer there. Whew, that was a lot to process.
Sorry.
And it always is. I mean, I do the work. I'm processing every day, and during that time, I have to always remember to take care of myself, you know, because it's important. But with that being said, I'm formerly incarcerated. I'm not going to say a returning citizen, because I don't feel I have my citizenship because I'm denied so much. So I'm going to talk about my experience, you know, like growing up and seeing my family struggle, my mother and my sister, from mental illness. And basically that's what led me to start going back and forth to jail and to prison. Mother struggling with mental illness, trying to raise 6 kids, living in the projects in poverty. You know, I feel like living in poverty and not having the things that you basically need is enough to make anybody mentally ill, and you not having anyone to talk to, or not having the help you need in order to survive. So she's sending 6 of us to Catholic school. You know, my dad is up in age. It's rough, right? And my sister, who is 7 years older than me, and I love my sister dearly, she started having her own struggles, being diagnosed. But before she was diagnosed, you know, I started noticing some things. But because both my parents worked and were always at work, and we were basically latchkey kids, they didn't see it. And when it was brought to their attention, you know, it was kind of like swept under the rug. What I see done a lot in the community in which I live. Mental illness is ignored. Like, oh, that's Uncle Johnny, he'll be fine. Just give him a plate, put him in the basement, don't bother him, he'll be fine, until somebody gets hurt. And then they still don't get the help they need, and we just want to lock them away either in an institution, and they really don't get the help they need, and it continues to go further, right? So my sister used to abuse me, and I would tell my parents, and it was just like, okay, she has to watch you, we have nobody else. I eventually left home and took to the streets at the age of 12. And that's when I started going back and forth to jail, right? In prison. So, you know, and I wasn't educated on mental illness at first, and of course there's a stigma that comes behind it, and when you see a person act this way, you tend to say things, especially as a child, like you're crazy. So I might have egged some of that on, but nobody deserves to be abused, right? So they end up putting my sister into a hospital when she lashed out at my mom, and my mom got hurt, you know. So with me going back and forth to jail and prison, you know, of course I'm beginning to see some things and how women are treated when it comes to having a mental illness. And I can very much well say that I was mentally disturbed as well, because I struggled with drug addiction for many of years. Started using heroin at the age of 17 and cocaine at the age of 20, and I've been drug-free for 8 years now. So, you know, I struggled with many things, and it wasn't until I got the help that I needed, and which I shouldn't have had to go to jail or prison to get that help. But that is where I found the help in Decatur Correctional Center in the Wells program, and they no longer have that program. So, yeah, so my concern is, what are the women to do now, you know? And it was there where I learned some coping skills on how to deal with some of the things that I was thinking, just how to live, really, and I had someone to talk to. So basically, you know, people need people. We need people to talk to. It's not right to be locked in a cage 23-1, looking at a cell. You know, I think about the times when we were locked in a cage because of a lockdown, and you can't even get out to take a shower. They bring your meals to you, and as tension starts to rise, I mean, it's hot in there. I mean, you like, you in my space, hey, and there it is, right? I know prison isn't equipped to deal with mental illness. I've seen many women diagnosed with the same diagnosis, and everybody is what we call the Skittle line when you're in prison. I mean, because a lot of times the women are going through just not knowing how to deal with life, period, and wanting to ease the pain or forget about being incarcerated. So sometimes women would say when they really wouldn't be mentally ill, the ones that had severe mental illness would not get the help. And the ones that were, okay, I just want to get on medication so I can sleep this bit off. I mean, I've seen it done, and with nobody to talk to. If there was seeking safety or any type of class for domestic violence, you only have a handful of women who are getting those services because everybody can't attend. So when you come home, you are still messed up. You're still messed up because you didn't get the help that you needed inside. My thing is, every day, I stay in the South Shore neighborhood, and every day when I catch the bus home, like 71st and Jeffrey, I mean, I see it every day, and it's like, all the mental health facilities that were around are now gone. And we're sending these people to prison, and they're still not getting the help that they need. It's like there needs to be some level ground, some medium of, you know, where can we meet at? It's either you're gonna get it here, or you're gonna get it there. When is it gonna happen? Yeah, that's all I want to say. If you guys have questions, later I can answer those for you. I'm gonna pass the mic to Monica.
Hey everyone, thank you for being here. My name is Monica Cosby. I work with Next Steps. I'm an organizer with Moms United Against Violence and Incarceration, and I work with a number of other organizations in the Chicago area. I was incarcerated for 20 years. I've been out for 15 months now. I feel like, can everybody back there hear me? Yes. Okay, because I feel like I'm shouting and I don't want to shout. So I'm sitting at a table with 3 heroes, a lifelong friend and mentor, my friend Colette, and I'm angry and sad about the things that I've seen happen, that not just that have happened to me, because my story is so similar to the story of so many women, right? But seeing this many people in a room interested in caring about having this conversation gives me hope, so thank you for that. So this is a little about me. Just like most of the women that are incarcerated right now, I was physically and sexually abused as a child, and in my teen and young adult years, I entered into relationships that played out that same dynamic, right? I was in violent, abusive relationships, and then I was incarcerated for 20 years, and the dynamic in prison is very much similar to the dynamic that you have in abusive relationships, right? And that whole dynamic of power over that I talk a lot about. So while I was in prison, I had like what we call the common prison experience. Like I did the things in prison that most of us do in prison, but I also was able to witness some extraordinarily beautiful things that have happened to me, right, with the women that I've been locked up with. And one of the ways, so struggling with mental illness in prison resultant from my trauma, while I was in Cook County Jail, oh gosh, this is hard to talk about. So while I was in Cook County Jail, I had been there for about 2.5 years already, and I thought that I saw the man that terrorized and abused me. I thought I saw him in myself, right? So, and I thought I saw him like a few different times earlier during the day. So I was thinking to myself, well, I can't be crazy. I can't be. There's nobody there. And I told myself this all day. And then when lockup time came, I tried to go up the stairs, and I couldn't go up the stairs because there was somebody in my room, and I was just determined to not go in that room. So when you're in jail or prison and you refuse to lock up, this is what happens to you. The cops beat they rough you up, like seriously. I'm trying not to cuss because TV stuff. So you get beat up, you get handled like really rough. They pepper spray you, and they F you up, and they stick you in your room, or they F you up and they drag you off to segregation or solitary confinement. So knowing this, as I had seen this happen to umpteen other people while I was there for refusing to lock up, so I knew that this could happen to me. And all I could think was, that's not going to be as bad as what's going to happen to me if I go in that room with somebody waiting to terrorize me some more. This is the state that I was in. And the part that differs from what happens to most people is that the CO in question, so I'm not going to say his name. It took me forever to remember his name, by the way. I'm not going to say his name because I don't know if he still works there or not, and I don't want to front anybody, which is like, that's a prison rule. You don't front people that are decent to you. And that's a shame, because people shouldn't be ashamed for treating people as human beings, but that's the way it runs in prison, in jail. So this CO, when he came and he says, Cosby, it's lockup time, I need you to lock up. And I said, no. He said, Cosby, don't make me ask you again, I need you to lock up, it's lockup time. And I said, I'm not going in that room. He actually asked me why. And so I told him, hey, there's somebody in that room and he's gonna kill me if I go in there, and I'm not going in that room. And he just looked at me, he was like, oh, and I remember the look on his face so clear. He was like, oh man, I don't wanna have to deal with this. But he says, look, I just need you to stay right here. I'm gonna go check your room out. And he went up the stairs and he checked out the room, and he came back, he was like, I didn't see anything, but I'm gonna try to get you somewhere safe, right? Now this was not the norm back in the 90s, right? Back then, and for the most part, even today, they're gonna beat you the F up and do what they need to do, and you're gonna get dragged into your room, or you're gonna get dragged off to solitary confinement after they beat you up and pepper spray you. So he goes upstairs, he looks at the room, he comes back and he tells me he doesn't see anything, but I'm gonna get you somewhere safe. So he gets on his radio, he was like, hey, I need somebody to relieve me. I got somebody to go to 5, which at that time it was Division 5 is where they took you in Cook County Jail to do a psych eval before they took you to Division 3, which is their psych wing, right? So this happens, and he was decent enough not only to call for somebody to relieve him so he could leave his wing, and he walked with me with the 2 officers that were there to escort me to Division 5. That does not happen. Like, that is not the norm. Right? And I knew the chance that I was taking when I refused to lock up. I knew the chance I was taking, but that's how bad it was for me. I've seen the same situation where other women didn't get the help that I got, right? And I've seen them get beat up. I've seen them get pepper sprayed. I've seen them get dragged to solitary confinement. And it didn't, now I've been to solitary confinement, but not for that thing, right? But I've seen how this works out for women, and so many of them never come back from it. Like, literally, they never come back. They are still cycling in and out of IDOC today from the 90s, cycling in and out of IDOC today. Some of them wound up in prison. And I knew Tiffany, by the way. I knew Tiffany for a very long time. She's a good friend of mine. Some of these women, I have a friend named Victoria Woodridge. She killed herself. She committed suicide in IDOC because nobody helped her. They were more than happy to drag her to solitary for being sick and did not help her. And this is what happened. So the experiences that I've had like the very common experiences in prison, but I've also had enough decent ones where I was able to come back. But I've seen so many women who never come back. They're either trapped in the cycle and system of incarceration where they come in and out and come in and out, and they've been doing it for 20 or 30 years, or they never come out, period. They just go to a graveyard. And this is because mostly we don't know, and we don't care, and we don't care to know. And this is what this conversation is about tonight. I want everyone to really think about that. Most people in prison, for whatever they're in prison for however long they're in prison, are getting out one day, and we're coming back to communities near you, right? And for that matter, even while we're gone, most of us have a family out here. Like, very likely, you go to work with, wherever you work, you go to work with maybe not necessarily someone who was incarcerated, because it's kind of hard for some of us to get a job, but you may work with someone who has a husband or a wife or a son or a daughter or a brother or a sister in prison, or who has been to prison, right? If you have children, your kid may possibly, very likely, go to school with a child whose mom or dad or big brother or little sister is incarcerated. So we're not as far away from you as you may think. I want to share something with y'all. So there's this, one of my favorite Supreme Court cases is Alone versus Shabazz. I love the, there's a dissent written by Justice Brennan. So one of the things he says is that prisoners are persons whom most of us would rather not think about. Banished from everyday sight, they exist in a shadow world that only dimly enters our awareness. They are members of a total institution that controls their daily existence in a way few of us can imagine. It's a really long dissent, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. But every aspect of our lives is controlled from sunup to sundown, literally. Like when we can eat, when we can shower. Oftentimes, if you're locked in a room and you're in a room that doesn't have toilet facilities, you're not going to get to use the toilet unless they let you out, right? We don't have showers in our room, so if you're locked in your room, you don't get to take a shower. It's everything. This is not so with members of the general adult population. State governments have not undertaken to require members of the general adult population to rise at a certain hour, retire at a certain hour, eat at certain hours, or live with periods with no companionship, whatever. It doesn't require society doesn't require the general public to submit to oral and anal searches or any of the rest of that. It is thus easy to think of prisoners as members of a separate netherworld, driven by its own demands, ordered by its own customs, ruled by those whose claim to power rests on raw necessity. Nothing can change the fact, however, that the society that these prisoners inhabit is our own. We may exist on the margins of that society, but we're here, right? And so this conversation, that this many people showed up for this, proves to me that people know and people care. I just thank you so much for being here. I'm a little bit overwhelmed. I was like really, really nervous, and I've been at quite a few of these, right? And I was just really nervous. There is so much more to say. Like, when we think in terms of the work that we do, and the things that happen, like, we really do have the capacity to fundamentally change the world that Fred was talking about earlier. Like, we really are that powerful. All we have to do is do it. Like, it's great to sit around and have this conversation, and I really do appreciate I appreciate you all so much for being here. But beyond this, get involved, right? Get involved. Push your legislators to advocate. You advocate to your legislators to change laws, right? To give us more supports while we're in prison and upon coming out. When I first got out, I was still struggling, and in some ways I'm still struggling now, right? So when you're out of prison and you're on parole, if you have any kind of issues, this is what 9 times out of 10 you're told. Well, if you're really going through a crisis, you better call 911. So most people aren't going to do that, because when you call 911, even if you're a member of just the general public not on parole, calling 911 when you're in a crisis is probably not the best thing for you to do. If you are on parole, you're really not going to do that, because you're going to get taken back. You're going to be in violation of your parole. So our options are very few. And I think one of the keys to helping that is to build community, which is kind of different than having allies. We certainly need allies, but we also need to build community, right? And so that's in large part the work that I do, is to build community so that people have those support structures, so that we don't have to go back to prison, so we don't have to go to the things that we were doing before we went to prison to try to make us feel better and to cope, so that we can find healthier ways to cope, and there's something to be said for being heard and being listened to, and oftentimes we really don't have that. And I just thank you so much, y'all, for being here. And if anyone has any questions for any of us, feel free to ask.
By the way, again, because what we're having is a conversation, if you have questions, that's good, but if you disagree, that is equally important. So we want to have a conversation, we want to hear from you, and we want to begin to make the change. So I just wanted to make that part clear, that this isn't just one way, us imparting knowledge to you, but us trying to be changed from you. Thanks.
Somebody must have something to say.
I have a few questions.
Kathy?
Here.
Thank you so much. I cried, you made me cry, and that's a good thing. Somebody stated that there are no laws in place for people in prison for the way they're treated. And I just want to bring up something that sprung into my mind, and that is the law against cruel and unusual punishment. And I believe that's a constitutional right, is it not?
Yes.
Okay, so there are laws. We just have to get people like Alan on our side and push them. Yeah, we have to push them. I was wondering how much the stigma about mental illness plays in the prison system. Like, do people think that because you're crazy, you just don't have control over your mind, or it doesn't matter, we're just going to control you? What's the deal? Tell me.
A lot of times in the prisons, is this on?
No.
Oh, crap.
Close your mouth.
If the green light is on,
Oh, well, then just get closer.
get closer.
All right, is this better?
No.
It's not on.
Test.
There it
Here.
is.
Okay, I got it again?
Yeah.
All right. A lot of times it's seen as manipulation,
Okay.
right? So a lot of times there's that, and a lot of times, I mean, it is just a stigma, so it's seen as manipulation, and it's also seen as some sort of inherent weakness or some type of fundamental flaw that makes you a bad person. And so you're not, so the want to deal with you just doesn't exist.
Because you have
Right.
mental illness.
Right.
That's what I wanted to know. Thank you. Anybody else?
I just want to add that. I think that the default in a prison system is always punishment. And anything that causes a prisoner to act other than in accordance with the rules that are laid down by the prison system is viewed as something that needs to be punished. So the default for mental illness is punishment. That is the knee-jerk reaction, and you're right, it violates the cruel and unusual punishment clause to punish people for being ill. But that is what we do. We punish people because they are ill, rather than recognizing mental illness as just like any other illness. What's needed is treatment, not punishment. I always say we would never lock someone in a room who has a 100-degree fever and say, we'll let you out when your fever comes down. But that's what we do. We say we're not going to give you group therapy. We're not going to give you one-on-one therapy if you misbehave. We're going to send you to segregation, and you have to behave in order to earn the treatment. It's exactly backwards.
That's crazy.
It is.
Right, but that's what we do.
And one more third part is that, something about Monica's story reminded me as well, and just picking up on Alan's comments. Oh, speaking of, sorry about that. Is that, we've talked a lot today about the fact that prisoners almost aren't treated as human. So the normal interaction you'd have with somebody is, as Monica mentioned, just in the community is not necessarily a normal interaction in a prison setting. That's where people are trained that command and control is the order of the day. So even people that might not begin with a mental illness sometimes develop them in a prison setting, or it triggers additional behaviors that just don't fit in the construct. And the second part of what Monica said about her unusual interaction with the officer that she mentioned, where he actually talked to her when she was having a traumatic episode, that's not the norm. And while that might seem common sense if you see someone in need or experiencing something out in the community, that you would talk with them, people aren't trained that in prison. The community, we're bringing funding in through WJI for a cutting edge, and it really isn't. When I saw it, I thought it's great, but it just seemed like common sense. It's a cutting edge program called Communications Regulation and Resiliency to the staff at Logan. And the officers were blown away by exactly that interaction, where they're told, listen, when I say you get 3 chances in the manual or I pepper spray you, which is basically what happens, because that's the response, the widget response. What they're taught is something, and believe me, this is kindergarten. They're taught something called here, hold on, elicit, acknowledge the issue the individual is having, and review it, and then move on to solutions. It's called here. So we did role-playing with officers for an entire day, and I have to say, with a fresh set of people working with the system, we're learning this, and it just seems so basic, but it's just not what the system was designed to do. We have to rethink the entire construct.
I kind of wish that the whole population would get that training.
Yeah.
Nobody's talking about it.
And just to give you an idea of why that kind of training is so important, I saw a video the other day at Logan of a woman who was, at least the mental health people said, they had a crisis. So they're being moved from their cell into what they call a crisis cell, someplace where it's harder to commit suicide. And she wasn't going voluntarily. Her position was, I'm not having a crisis. So they called in the tactical team, and they gave her the 3 orders saying cuff up, and she said, well, I'm supposed to be cuffed in front, not in back, and I can walk. I don't need to be cuffed at all, and went back and forth arguing. And it escalated, and then they started screaming at her, calm down. Screaming at her to calm down. Anybody who has kids know if they're upset and you scream at them saying stop screaming, it's only going to make things worse. And that's exactly what happened. And the next thing happened is pepper spray is out. They rush in the cell with the shields. They smash her to the ground. They handcuff her. And they eventually get her in a crisis cell, by which point, of course, she's actually having a crisis, which she wasn't in the beginning. So, God, I wish they had had that training.
It sounds to me like the correction system, which I know is very, very privatized now, as you serve the rights of handling mental health issues, and it seems like the state has been closing mental health facilities and just funneling those persons into the correction system. And I would just ask the panel to comment on what we can do to reverse that.
You want to take that? You want me to start?
You can start, because I don't know what to do.
All right, so, number one, let me correct the statement a little bit. Private prisons in Illinois are illegal. It's the one thing the state's done right. We do not have any private prisons, for now.
For now.
Roger doesn't talk about.
But that does not mean that nothing in prison is privatized. Because healthcare is privatized. All those doctors I'm talking about, they all work for a private company. There are lots and lots of people making lots and lots of money out of the prison system. So in that sense, you're right, but I just want to correct, private prisons in Illinois anyway are not the big problem. They're not a problem at all. But your bigger point is, why do we spend money on corrections instead of mental health in the community? And there's no good reason. The reason is because we let politicians get away with that. It's much easier to hide our problems than it is to solve them. The response to poverty has been lock people away. The response to homelessness has been to call the police and arrest people for sleeping on the sidewalk. The response to mental health is to call the police and send them to Cook County Jail, which is why we have a psychologist running Cook County Jail. So,
The largest.
and it is the largest mental health treatment facility. We treat more people in Cook County Jail for mental illness than in any other facility in the United States. So what's the solution? When a politician stands up and says, I'm going to solve a problem, ask them what the answer is other than incarceration. The real question you should be asking is, what are you going to do to reduce the number of people we are locking up? And not let them get away with a simplistic answer that I'm making the world better by locking more people up. We see this right now in the city of Chicago, where politicians are saying we need more mandatory sentences for gun laws in order to prevent violence. Don't let them get away with that. We already lock up 80 to 90% of the young black men in those neighborhoods, and it hasn't solved the problem. Is it 95% that's going to solve the problem? Are we going to do what John Cass says and build a wall around those communities so we don't have to bother to move them at all? We just move the prison to them? That's where we're headed. So don't let politicians get away with the idea that somehow incarceration is a solution to any problem. It's not.
Never. So, you were asking about the crises.
Mattresses, right.
Yeah. And, I mean, when I was in prison, for the many times that I was in there, I had never been to segregation, thank God, because I don't think I would have been able to hold up. But while doing the assessment that Deanne was talking about, we were assessing one of the domains, and I came across what they call as the crisis cage, and I went into a crisis myself, just seeing the cage. And the cage stood taller than me, 4 sides, gated with the chair in the inside, and it's a cage. I mean, literally, I mean, like for an animal, you know, and
They give you a chair?
it was a chair in the inside. I don't know what the chair was for, but my first response was, oh my God, what is this? You know, and just to tell you as to how they think of us, I'm speaking from a perspective of being incarcerated, these women are dangerous. They have weapons. I mean, when I was incarcerated, I mean, I've seen some things happen, but for the most part, they weren't that dangerous. And when you're in a crisis, if you put a person in a cage, I mean, I was like, the woman could hit her head against the bars, there's no padding, what is going on? You know, and you know, when he found out that I had been incarcerated, he just blew his top. So that was the most fun part of the day.
Can I add to that just really quick?
Here.
So a lot of times because I'm only speaking from a woman's perspective, a lot of times in prison, our responses to each other when we're in crisis tend to get policed and criminalized. Like, for example, if somebody loses a family member, a child, a parent, and I'm talking to my roommate or my friend, and this is what happens to me, and I'm all messed up. And my friend goes to hug me for comfort and solidarity. That's a ticket. Like our natural response to being, our natural response as, because we are a community, right? And our natural response is to try to care for each other. That gets policed and criminalized when you're in the criminal justice system, like just to hug someone, right? So if your only response to crises and trauma is to punish every response to it, not even the person who's been traumatized. Like, I lost my dad about 3 weeks before I was released. And my friend, who's one of my closest friends, who is still in prison right now, went to hug me, and one CO took both of our IDs to write an inmate, we call them tickets, they're inmate disciplinary reports. Both of us were about to get a ticket, just because she went to hug me. She was like, oh, I'm so sorry about your dad, and went to hug me. And the CO was like, hey, y'all know you can't be doing that stuff. Like, everything is punitive, and it doesn't have to be that way. You know, if it was an impossibility to change things, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So therefore, it's not impossible, because we are all here, and this fundamentally creates change.
Is that why our politicians put more money into prisons? And then, as you know, President Donald Trump rolled back one of the Obama executive orders that reduced incarceration, and that prison companies gave Trump a donation. And so the slogan is "Make America Separate Again, Make America Poor Again."
Yeah.
And then in the city, you also have seen people with mental illness being fatally shot by police because of lack of training. And that the police shootings on our people of color, especially those with mental illness and those with autism, is 21st century of lynchings in the South.
Yep.
I'm in complete
Nope.
agreement with that.
Yes, what's the question about today's racist system in the police department, and how are we gonna overcome this tolerance? I know we have a billionaire president, a billionaire governor, and a millionaire mayor who only caters to themselves and their wealthy friends.
Yeah, I mean, he answered the question already. Get the right people elected. Got one over here? One up here?
There's a question over here.
The PTSD I got as a child from my father beating me, it never got diagnosed until I was 59 years old. So my whole life was just a bunch of layers upon layers of other mitigating circumstances that I really didn't know what was wrong with me until I got this PTSD diagnosis and started getting my hands wrapped around it, taking classes to mitigate it, cognitive thinking with PTSD and anger management. Those were the things that really got me going. But what I'm involved in right now is trying to get the police and the medical responders to get together to understand that when you have mental illness and you're out in the street and you get attacked or you get hurt, whatever it is, you're in crisis. You're in crisis. And if the police and first responders can't acknowledge that, we all have a problem. That's all.
Right.
First of all, thank you to all four of you for being here tonight. I just have two questions, one for Ms. Benos and one for Mr. Mills. So the first one, you talked about the gender-informed assessment. You talk about gender-specific programs. We want more, just across the board, more education, more job programs, things like that. What kind of specific programs for women for the future that you would like envision to be put into the women's correctional facilities. And then I don't remember which one had mentioned about calling our legislators, pushing policies. Is there anything specific that you would like to mention to us about pushing policy?
You go first.
I could go on a long list, and I seem to be winded, so I'll be really quick so more people can talk. I like your questions, though, and I'd love to. We have a website, www.womensjustice.net, where people can request a copy of our report, and we have some data on Illinois and women, and we're going to keep people updated on news articles and developments and ways to get involved. But quickly, I would say that as far as gender-informed practices, right? So one is just fundamentally, and this goes back to some of the policing issues people have talked about, but it's fundamentally, how do people approach their job interacting with people? So we have a bunch of young people that have grown up thinking cops and robbers, and if you add and correctional officers into that game, right? It's this thinking that they're in to do hardcore security work. When really people are, these individuals, and we're seeing this increasingly, are interacting with some of the most vulnerable individuals in our society with the lack of training to recognize how to engage them and recognize crisis and true threats, and when to use a gun and when to shoot and when not to, or when to just talk to somebody. So that's an issue. So I would say first, with gender-informed practices, it's trainings like the CR2 I talked about for everyone that works in the environment. There's 5 core principles of gender responsiveness by which people should operate, and we have it listed, and because I'm speaking quickly, I'm not going to remember them all. But one of them is that systems should be relational. So something we're working on is making the prison, Logan itself, since it's a monstrosity of a huge prison with women of like 25 different needs and classifications, we're breaking it down into smaller facilities in what's called a program called unit management. And you create small communities within those groups where women can relate to and get to know the officers on their units, and they can understand the patterns of women and their needs as they move forward. We're looking at peer-led programming, and Monica and I had spoken about this too, where you're not just training an officer or someone from the outside to lead a group of women in evidence-based practice, you're actually training the women themselves to support each other. A program that we've looked at, there's one called Moving On that actually has some considerable data. It's by Marilyn Van Deeten. It's based on women that have experienced trauma, and it has several stages. There's one that you can progress into called Living Safely and Free from Violence, which addresses violence, but it can be peer-led, and it has some data showing it reduces recidivism and the incidents within a facility. There's a number of services. There's also people that deliver trauma-informed yoga. There's trauma-informed yoga, the Prison Yoga Project. I'd love to see that there. There's all kinds of different services that are out there, and I'm glad to share more.
Go to the back for the next question.
I was going to answer that one, then we can go to the back, yeah. So there's 4 things I want to talk about in terms of specific pieces of legislation. They go from sort of very specific to more general. I talked a lot about people who are locked in their cells 24 hours a day. There is a bill currently pending, House Bill 259, which in essence says every prisoner in the state of Illinois has to be given the opportunity at least 4 hours a day to get out of their cell and do something. If you want to lock people up more than that, you can do it for a maximum of 10 days. It passed out of committee, it's before the full House, so you should call your representative, say vote yes on House Bill 259. I don't have the bill number, but the one I talked about, mandatory minimums for gun crimes. It is very popular in the legislature because all the legislatures say we have to do something about violence, and this is the only thing we can think of. So tell them no. That is, they should vote against mandatory minimums. You're not in favor of putting more people in prison for gun crimes.
Is there a bill on it?
There is a bill on it. Do you know the number, Holly? HB 3421.
Give her the mic.
The simple way to describe it is it eliminates cash bail for people in City and Cook County Jail, so we get people out of the jail instead of sitting there for months or, as Monica described, 2.5 years waiting for trial. On a more general level, I said a lot of the things we were talking about for mental health in particular are waiting budgets. The budget for appropriations will be heard, we believe, next week in the House. And the budget that was actually, as bad as he is, the budget that was proposed by the governor includes all that money for mental health. So again, that's something the legislature has to vote on, and yes, they should vote yes on funding the mental health care in prisons. But just in general, it's important to call any legislator anytime and say, I care about prisons. Because anytime we go down to Springfield and talk to legislators, the first thing we hear is, I never get a call saying prisons are too tough. I get lots of calls saying, we want to lock more people up and prisons are too soft. So it's important that they hear from the other side, even if it's not about a particular bill. They need to know that there are people who actually care about the prison system and think it's bad. Want to add anything?
We have time for just one more question.
I got a bill.
Man way in the back has had his hand up forever.
Okay.
And then you can do your bill.
Budgeting, we touched on it a little bit, but how fluid is the budgets that are passed for the prison system, for law enforcement in general, and can that act in some sense as a type of quota? Whereas if we're allocating X amount of funds, for detainees and stuff like that, does that necessarily act as law enforcement saying, well, if we have this amount of money coming in this year, in order for us to guarantee that amount of money coming in next year, that means we have to incarcerate more people, and does that affect, people with mental illnesses more as they may be more prone to be arrested?
You're a policy
I'm gonna pass this right off to Alan in a moment and say a couple things. I know that that's a theory when you have a private prison environment. You can see news articles about that across the country where judges are in on a fix to send more, especially young people, to facilities for contracts. Obviously, we don't have private, thank God, private facilities here where that's the case. So I don't think that there's necessarily a quota in that way. I think that Illinois, as Alan touched on, is driven a lot by politics and perception. No one wants to be the guy that lets somebody out that then went to do something else. And that's really a failure to educate the public. I remember once when I served at the Department of Corrections, a legislator asked me, we had developed these reentry centers in like 8 areas of the state, and one legislator said, I don't want one of these in my community, and where do you have the money for that anyway? I think we should cut half of them. And so we walked around the room and we said, okay, so on this committee, you're from Elgin, you're from Aurora, you two are from Chicago. Which of you doesn't want to prevent crime in your community and promote healthy families? Which one? How much can you afford to lose? And so people aren't educated to know that perhaps no matter what, you're dealing with a population with 80,000 people, I guess from just the state system alone, that are there because they face challenges in their lives. And you're not going to be 100% successful in that. There's no one that can guarantee, even I won't commit a crime like somebody makes me mad. I'm just kidding. But if then any of us, or that anyone could not commit a crime if they step out of somewhere. But you're can pretty darn be sure that if we invest in people and effective programs and systems, that we will be considerably less likely to have crime in our communities and considerably more likely to have successful, healthy people, families, and communities. So I think that's a media issue as well as a political one, and I think they bear some responsibility for that.
So we're currently working on a bill, HB 2373, which will expand the eligibility for sealing. Right now, it's only, I think it's 9 felonies that are eligible for sealing, and we want to expand that so that when we come home, we'll have access to jobs, housing, and the basic necessities. So HB 2373, and what we are including in that is that murder would also be eligible for sealing as well. So that's very important, because when people hear the word murder, they just hear that word, not knowing the underlying circumstances of how a person got to that point and what even happened in their case. And women a lot of times are charged because of accountability. So, yeah.
Thank you.